Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Again, I want to start by saying that this video is not an endorsement or criticism of any state or actor. I am trying to be as objective and fair as possible. So, the last time I was in the US, which was about 10 days ago, I saw many relatives, family, friends, acquaintances that I hadn't seen in a couple of years. And naturally, they were curious about my circumstances and had many questions because they sort of remembered that I had been to Moscow, but then I had come back to the US. And then here I was in Moscow, but now I'm visiting by myself in the US. So they were a little bit confused. So the question of why did I leave the US in 2023 to go ultimately back to Moscow? Well, fair question. And so before I answer that, I think I should probably back up and explain why I moved to Moscow initially in 2017. Now, I've always known that I would probably move abroad at some point in my life. I think some people are just inclined to do so, while others are not. My father, for instance, I don't think he would leave the Midwest of the United States even under the threat of imminent alien invasion. And the other extreme, it's not uncommon to hear stories about people with six-figure jobs living in beautiful parts of the United States choosing to quit everything and backpack around Southeast Asia while living on passive income and sleeping in hostels. And I think I probably fit more in the latter camp. But I think if my personal situation in life at that time had been better, then I may have stayed and not been tempted to travel abroad. But fair to say, in 2017, I was having some personal problems, and I just kind of wanted to start over or at least take a long break. So my background with Russia at that time was very, very limited, but I'd always been interested in the country because my parents adopted a baby from the far east of Russia in a city called Birobidzhan. This was in 1999. And so, of course, he became my brother. And although I did not go with them on this trip, I remember growing up always seeing these pictures of their travels and them talking about it and seeing these pictures of places like Moscow and Birobidzhan and just being totally just fascinated by it. I think it was the first time when I became aware of the concept of there being different languages or different alphabets or that there are other countries. Because the sheer strangeness of it really left an impression on me. And I was I'd always been very, very interested in Russia ever since then. And so around Christmas time, 2016, going into 2017, I literally had a dream one night that I was in Moscow, and I woke up from this dream determined to visit there somehow. And so I actually immediately bought plane tickets to Moscow for like 6 months later. And I didn't even have money to buy it. I had to use credit to pay for it. And then later on, I found out that you needed a visa to go to Russia. I did not even know what a visa was. And I ran into a few other issues, and so I ended up wasting the entire trip. Although I did eventually go to Russia, but it was later. It was September 2017. And then I moved in with a girl I had met online, and we began living together at that time. And it was a period of enormous change, as you would expect. I worked 7 days a week for months at a time, since it was the first time in my life when I had an opportunity to make such easy money. So that part was great, although it was stressful. I struggled with the language and had some difficulties adjusting to this new country that was so different. I'd also moved during a kind of low point in my relationship with my parents, which added some sad background noise to the experience. I ended up getting married in June 2028. I'm sorry, that year hasn't happened yet. I ended up getting married in June 2018, and things gradually improved, at least until COVID, which I could probably make a separate series about. To me, the COVID years in Moscow were worse than what we're experiencing now, and just in terms of a day-to-day impact. Maybe I'll talk more about this in the future, but anyway, my son was born in early February 2022, and this was actually quite a stressful pregnancy because he was breech, and my wife was running low on amniotic fluid. And to top it off, our hospital had many draconian and ridiculous COVID restrictions. So, for example, on the day of my wife's C-section, she had to be tested for COVID. And the rule was if she tested positive, then she would actually be sent to a different hospital far away with different doctors to give birth. These would be doctors who weren't familiar with her particular case. So that pissed me off, and it made me very, very nervous. But luckily, she tested negative, and she gave birth at that hospital. Or my son was born via C-section at that hospital. I don't know if that counts as giving birth, but he came out healthy. All was good for us for 2 weeks until February 24th, 2022. And so, of course, this video is not a commentary on that. But at that time, I did think it was best for us to go to the USA. This was quite difficult to do because plane tickets were now costing around $10,000 because there were super limited routes because of all the foreign airlines leaving, and then European airspace being closed to Russian airlines, and combined with extremely high demand. So prices were very, very high. And my son did not even have American citizenship yet, so he couldn't even enter the United States. He didn't have an American passport. He didn't have citizenship. After he was born, I'd applied for these things just as a precaution, and the embassy told me that they weren't providing it because of COVID, and so they weren't providing passports. And they sent me a super nasty email explaining this. So anyway, at that moment, I went to go to the U.S., and my son did not have an American passport. And so I then contacted the embassy again and said, like, okay, well, now can you give us a passport? Which they did, to be fair. And so he received American citizenship and an American passport in early March 2022. And my wife had a valid tourist visa to the U.S. It was, I think, a B2 tourist visa. But this visa expired in a few months, but it was still valid for entry into the United States. But no foreigner could enter the U.S. without one of the American COVID vaccines, which my wife did not have. So in order to be admitted into the USA, we had to use the embassy again to contact the CDC to get an exemption to allow her to fly to the U.S. without one of these vaccines. We eventually made it to the USA after my parents paid $9,000 for the three of us to travel one way from Moscow to Dubai, from Dubai to Chicago. Where they then picked us up and drove us to Dayton, Ohio. And unfortunately, we had to leave my cat, who you can probably see sleeping on the bed. We had to leave him with my wife's family because the airline did not allow pets on such long flights. And to me, this was the most heartbreaking aspect of leaving Russia, in addition to this just enormous uncertainty ahead of us. And so we arrive in the U.S., and as you can imagine, the adjustment was extremely tough. None of us had health insurance. My wife and I no longer had jobs, and I don't think I even had a U.S. bank account at that time because prior to the sanctions, Russian cards worked all over the world, and so I had no need for a separate debit card that was connected with SWIFT because my Russian card worked for all those purposes. And so we arrived with no money. We couldn't even withdraw rubles while we were in Moscow and exchange them for dollars toward the end because they had frozen all foreign currency transactions. And so we arrived with basically nothing. I think a couple $100 max, definitely less than $1,000. And so we immediately applied for Medicaid, which only my son and I received. And we also immediately applied for a legal option for foreigners, where a foreigner who is on a visitor visa can adjust his status to that of a green card applicant. This is called an adjustment of status. We applied for that, as well as a document called advance parole. This advance parole document was crucial because it would have allowed my wife to leave the U.S. and return, even though her visa was now expired. So in theory, had she gotten this advance parole document, she could have left, gone back to Russia, gotten our cat, gotten our money, maybe sold our couch, for things like that, and then potentially come back to the U.S. and still had her green card. Okay. Because she was in the status of adjusting to a green card, she couldn't legally work, she couldn't qualify for government subsidized health insurance, and she couldn't obtain a driver's license. Although I think this rule was unique to Ohio. But the reality is all these restrictions made life very, very hard, combined with just a complete isolation because I'm not from Dayton. I didn't know anybody there. And not to be overly cynical, but it's just not a very good place to live. We did find a few things we enjoyed in Southwest Ohio. There are a couple of cute small towns, and there are some kind of, good salt to the earth people, but we weren't very happy there. It was pretty tough. I found a low paying remote corporate job, and my wife was in a very, very deep depression. We were fighting a lot. She was desperate to return to Moscow, and I was nervous about what to expect in Russia. And I really pushed her to wait until at least she had this advanced parole document. Um, but we'd applied for all these documents in March 2022, and even after waiting over a year, not a single one of them had been processed or approved. And my wife said, "Well, I don't care. I'm gone." And so I was frantically making phone calls to different agencies, trying to figure out why there'd been no updates. Why, if we leave, what is there still some way we can come back in? Absolutely no information. Nobody helped me. I never received any clarification whatsoever. And so we ended up leaving. We went to Georgia, as I mentioned in a previous video, because I wasn't ready psychologically to go back to Moscow yet because I was too nervous. But then after a couple months, we did end up moving back to Moscow. And so our current situation, my wife still does not have a green card, and she doesn't have a tourist visa, and it's not entirely clear if she can get one because the American embassy here does not provide tourist visa interviews anymore. And so she'd have to travel to a third country. And we've talked to people, and the majority of them have all been rejected. And if you've recently been in the US for the purposes of a green card, but then you're applying for a tourist visa, it increases your chances of being rejected. And so we're not totally sure what to expect. To be clear, our plan really is not to move back to the US. Ideally, we would just like for her to have the ability to go there, because it's been tough for my parents not to see my son as often as they would like. They've had to meet us in third countries. And so the reality is things have basically worked out here, but it is quite difficult not knowing what kind of the status of not knowing what the future of my wife with the US will be. And so, but anyway, so that's why I initially came to Moscow, and then that is why I came back even after leaving in the U.S. That's why I came back after living in the U.S. And so, I hate to say this, but I would say it really was more what we would call push factors that caused us to go back to Moscow rather than pull factors. So with migration, we talk about push factors and pull factors. We really just kind of felt pushed to leave living in Dayton because, again, it was just not a very comfortable way to go through our new life as a young family. And although I was nervous about Moscow, things have worked out. And, well, now you know why I'm here.